Curtis. I use she, her pronouns. I'm a second-year doctoral student at Loyola University, Chicago, where the journal is housed. Our acronym is JCSHESA. I have served as editor-in-chief for these last 2 years, and I'm currently physically located here in Chicago, which is a city in the Midwest that sits on the ancestral homeland of the Anishinaabe, Nishui-Miskodewan, the Council of the Three Fires, and the Ojibwe, Ottawa, and Potawatomi. So before we go any further, I want to acknowledge the lives and memories of Indigenous people who have been and continue to be erased by the actions of colonizers and current settlers through violence, colonization, and displacement, while also recognizing the remarkable resilience of these Indigenous peoples and the American Indian community that continue to practice their tribal and intertribal cultures, even as we are here together right now. Myself and all of us at JCSHESA remain committed to naming and addressing our privileged and internalized settler colonial thoughts and behaviors as we work with and learn from others while residing in these stolen lands. Today and always, I honor and respect the many Indigenous people still connected to this land on which I gather with you virtually today. All right. Very excited to get started. We have some stellar panelists joining us today. Before I hand it over to Nick to introduce them, I would like to briefly cover some presentation logistics. First, for all of our participants in the house, please do remain muted throughout this panel. We have a number of co-hosts from the editorial board who will be monitoring the chat box. So if you have questions, you can drop them there. We'll also be helping to ensure all microphones remain muted. So we're here to kind of help you out with that, but please do ensure that your red microphone icon is off. After Nick introduced the panelists, we'll have 30 minutes of moderated Q&A from questions that have been prepared and submitted by you in advance, our participants. Then we'll open it up to live questions from everyone for the final 15 minutes, and I'll give a cue when it is time to submit that. Sorry, to transition to that. If you want to submit a question, so as you're listening, if a question comes to mind, you can submit that to Karina Castro. She has a photo icon. Her name is there. It's a picture of her. She has brown hair and glasses. You can submit your questions through direct message to Karina. And at the live Q&A portion, Karina will be reading those out. So the meeting is being recorded. We assume that by you being with us, you consent to being recorded. And I believe closed captions are available, yes, via the live transcript box at the bottom of your screen. So I highly encourage toggling that on so that we can read along and listen along. And without further ado, I'll turn it over to JCSHESA Associate Editor, Nick Havey, to introduce today's panelists and begin our 30 minutes of prepared questions. Welcome. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Sydney. So I'm just going to introduce everyone in alphabetical order, and then we'll dive into questions. So Dr. Alex Lange is a researcher at the University of Iowa. Astrid Pickenpack is a Ph.D. student in the higher education program at the Penn Graduate School of Education. John Okstad is a graduate research and teaching assistant at Loyola University, Chicago. Dr. Maurice Shirley is an assistant professor of higher education and student affairs at Indiana University. Dr. Damani White-Lewis is a postdoctoral scholar at the University of Maryland, College Park. And Annie Wofford is a PhD candidate in higher education and organizational change at the University of California, Los Angeles, and an incoming postdoctoral researcher at Northern Arizona University. So without any further ado, we'll launch into our first question. Just a note for the panelists, obviously everyone is welcome to dive in on every question. If it feels like we've sort of covered the bases, feel free to just not chime in. So we'll just start with kind of the first question and sort of the timeline, the journey. Can you guys tell us a little bit about your first experience submitting and publishing your work? And would you give your past self any advice on that experience? And you guys all have the ability to unmute yourselves, right? Yeah.
This is a very reflective question to start with, Nick. Personally, I was mortified to submit something for the first time. It was a co-authored piece with 2 faculty members, one of which was my mentor in my master's program, and I had just finished my master's degree, and she brought me on to help out with some data collection, of which I was just learning how to do. And she was, kind of throwing me in the deep end of what research is and helping me reach for the floaty along the way. And it was very scary to submit work that I had helped with for the first time, not knowing how this process went, how long it would take to receive feedback, what that feedback would look like. And so I did feel like it was just learning along the way. Advice for my past self is like, it's okay to be scared, and that is a normal part of the process, especially when you have worked very hard on a thing. But that it's also okay to get feedback, and any feedback you receive does not mean you are more or less worthy as a scholar.
I think just to piggyback on that, I think I'm one of the more junior folks in this group here as a PhD student still. My first journal article I'd worked on actually started about 3.5 years ago, and it's finally coming out now. And when I've had other ones jump into the timeline, they're already done and published. So my first has been my longest. And I think for me to learn of like how long that process really is. And I remember getting a revise and resubmit, and I didn't really know the process, and getting that, I'm like, oh, it wasn't good enough. But then meeting with my advisor, and he's like, that is amazing. Like, that is good. They still want it. Just fix it and make it better, right? And so I think recognizing that, and advice to myself, and similar to what Annie had said, I think being open to feedback. I was so hesitant that I had scheduled timelines for my writing, and my advisor was willing to give feedback on it. And I was so scared to send it to him because I felt like it was, this judgment of like judging my work, my worthiness to be in higher ed. But, first time I sent it to him, he just said, send it to me. Anything is great. And that this is moving us forward. So I think being open to feedback and not being scared. And of course, just even if getting anything on paper is just getting something on paper, and it's always going to be better from that. So that's something that I wish I would have known of how long the process is, and being more open to feedback.
Yeah, I agree. So my first experience was when I was a master's student, also here at the University of Maryland, College Park. And my then advisor at the time, Dr. Sharon Fries-Brett, once said, and I still hold this very near and dear to me, is that feedback is a gift. And I think when I first heard that, I thought she was tripping. Honestly, I was just like, no, this feels like an attack. But now, when I get feedback, honestly, I'm kind of excited, just because, especially, I guess it depends on how I viewed the manuscript prior to submission. If I thought it was like really squeaky clean and I get an R&R, I'm still excited, but I'm like, okay, like what's the issue? I'll still make the fixes, of course. But sometimes I'll submit papers and I'm like, I don't really have high hopes for this. And I'll get such great feedback, even if it's a rejection. I've been excited for rejections because that means I can fix it and then send it somewhere else. So, I always try to get my papers reviewed by a colleague or a mentor before submitting anywhere. And depending on how busy they are, the quality of the comments can vary. But hopefully, when you submit to a journal and you get good feedback, it's good enough so that even if you do get a rejection, you can turn that around. So honestly, sometimes I'll get in my feelings about rejections, which is of course part of the process. And I know that wasn't part of your original question, Nick, but I think it's important for this question in particular. But it's a gift, unless it's said really meanly, that's never fun. But if it's quality feedback, then you can just take that and turn it around and submit it, and then hopefully get it accepted somewhere else.
My first experience publishing was just after my master's. I started working at a research center. I was publishing something, and my boss already has started writing it. And I feel like a good advice would be just trust the people you're working with. There's a reason why you're there. because sometimes you get caught up. Someone just mentioned like, you don't know what to write, or you're too anxious because you're maybe not gonna write something good. And my boss told me it's better something like that's written than something like that's not. So just start, and they are there to like support you also. So trust the people you're working with.
Alex and Maurice, did either of you have anything to add, or are you ready for a new question?
I like and retweet everything everyone has said, so I think we're good.
Perfect. So sort of in the same vein, someone else was interested in knowing how you know when your work is ready to be submitted, and if you have any tips for sort of crossing that Rubicon, getting over that barrier to actually, hitting the submit button.
Yeah, so I tend to know my work is done when I'm starting to nitpick it for commas, random words, when I start to hit the synonyms button on Microsoft Word, trying to replace words for a better word. So when it gets to that level of perfectionism, I have everything in a manuscript or in a publication, which is a book chapter, policy memo. Once I start doing little tweaks like that, I know it's time to get off the plate. That's just me being anxious and stressed, and once again a perfectionist, and at that point I'm not doing myself a service any longer. It's ready to go for a fresh set of eyes and ready to move on, so I can work on other things as well, because as other people have mentioned, you will get feedback no matter how perfect you think it is. All of your writing will be edited, even if it is quote unquote perfect going out the first time, you will get edited on the way back. So if you find yourself ever getting there where it's like, I need a better introductory clause, or I need a better direct quote, or this font is different or it needs to be justified, that's when it's just like, give it up, send it out, and move on to the next project or the next writing piece.
Yeah, I would completely agree. I think you've got to really know yourself as a writer. So for instance, I know that I will do like 2 solid out loud reads of papers before I submit. And if I do any more than that, I'll actually start ruining the paper, because I'll start degrading my writing in many ways. And so one, lean into what you've always been doing to know that your writing is of what quality you think it's going to be. But 2, I also will typically have someone read almost anything I send out before it goes out. And that's really sort of like my quality check of like, yes, this is ready. Or if someone notices like large glaring gaps in my arguments or my presentation of my empirical data, that's when I'm like, okay, I've got to workshop this a bit more. But holding on to it for too long in some ways can both degrade the work, and if you're talking about empirical work, depending on its depth and rigor, could also be a problem with age of the data as well. And so there's, in some ways, if the phenomenon of interest is more time bound than we think, it's got to start moving out there because of how long it takes to actually wind up in print somewhere. And so, yeah, that's what I would offer.
So on the road to submitting, you have to pick a venue, you have to pick a publication that you're submitting to. What is your process for matching your work with a particular outlet? Damani, you talked a little bit about like getting a reject and being excited about reshaping it for somewhere new. Can we talk a little bit about that process?
Sure. So there's a couple of things that go into it. There's both the sort of topical scope of journals, but then there are also more logistic requirements too. Maybe this might just be me, but I'm like really obsessed with page length because that matters. You know what I mean? How much page length you have affects the quality of arguments, or sometimes, I mean, it can work in the opposite way too, but that's something that I really pay attention to. And you got to, stay track of those things, right? So let's say you submit something to AERJ, which is like a huge page limit, and you get rejected, and you want to turn it around to some things. If you want to keep that length, you're going to have to find another journal that has a sort of similar page limit, but then you're also going to have to balance that with a sort of topical focus, right? It may turn out that other journals you're interested in have a much more restrictive page limit. And so it sounds like sort of benign, but it really does kind of matter, because I've had to like sort of cut down arguments or cut down pieces of the lit review or the discussion section in order to get something in there. And then another thing that I don't think people are really kind of saying that I think is fair and true and is out there is just impact factor, especially if you're an early career scholar. I mean, like, I wouldn't let that be your only point of consideration when you're thinking about submitting to a journal. But it's hard to balance against other factors in terms of audience, in terms of page limit. And I think especially for early career folks, it's one of the many, unfortunately and fortunately in some ways, indicators for where you want to submit your work.
In addition to what Damani offered, I think one thing I consider is who I want to be in conversation with. And, you know, I look at some of the most recent issues for a journal and I'm like, okay, who is publishing here? What are they writing about? Are these people that I'm citing in my own work? And, you know, am I referencing some scholarship that has already passed through the gates of this journal? And also who reads it. So some of the work that I do is going to be more relevant for like student affairs practitioners. Some of it is going to be more relevant for like scholars and policymakers. And so, or I've published in like a CBE life sciences education because I do a lot of work in STEM. And that's a really huge journal for disciplinary based researchers. And I thought, like, along with my co-authors, we thought that this journal would be a great audience for the work that we were doing. So there are, Damani's considerations are definitely things I also think about, but then also where it goes and who it's read by.
Yeah, I would agree with Annie and Damani on both things. One thing I would add is if I'm ever confused, maybe it's from a desk reject or just multiple rejections, or I've written this beautiful piece and I don't know where it should live, thrive, and survive. Sometimes I will look at my reference list and see which journals I've actually incorporated in the reference in the text. If it slants one particular way in terms of the review of higher education or AE or a J or something else, I'm like, well, I quoted a lot from that and I've cited a lot from that, so why not send it there, right? So it could be a way when you're stuck, or when I'm stuck, I guess I should say, is that if I don't know exactly where this piece fits or has multiple options, I'll look at my reference list just to see what I've been citing and then go for that journal.
Yeah, Maurice brought up a really good point that I want to piggyback on too. Because when you were saying that, Maurice, I was like, oh yeah, like I'm writing this paper right now. A lot of my work sort of is interdisciplinary in terms of organizational psychology, personnel psychology, all that kind of stuff. And so I'll cite them and the citations will be at the bottom of my paper. And I still struggle with this. My collaborators struggle with this. It's like, well, are we going to submit to a journal outside higher ed? And they may have different sort of expectations around methods, around page length, around, you know, so a lot of papers in psychology will have multiple different studies in a paper as opposed to like a sort of single study, which may be a little more customary within our field. And so those are choices that you have to balance when you're trying to figure out, okay, am I going to submit to my manuscript to a journal outside the field, or am I going to submit to something inside the field? I think there's more to be said about that, and feel free for anyone to chime in, but I think about that regularly, especially as we try to demonstrate breadth in our research and that we're conducting interdisciplinary research and we're in conversations with folks outside the field who we're borrowing and leveraging certain theories and methods.
I'm sorry. Yeah, I would add, I published from Chile, all of the things that I've done until now. So we also look, and we usually have to publish in indexed journals that are usually from here. So we look into journals that have been published before international stuff, because sometimes they're very like US centric. So we need to kind of taste the waters and see if they have published before. So we look into like the last 2 years of publishing, if our paper fits into that.
And I was just going to say, and echoing from what Damani and Maurice had said, and I think Annie as well, is that I think you have to also think of normalizing this tension to a little bit of where your scholarly identity is. That, you know, one of the journal articles that I had worked on was in the Journal of Interprofessional Care, which is a healthcare journal. It's well respected within interprofessional IPE education. However, not so much within my discipline of higher education, right? And so I think we have to normalize that kind of that tension point there of where is your scholarly identity and where is it going? And I know for me, I'm still working my doctorate, and that's a tension that I'm working through and trying to understand, and how do I articulate my own research agenda, but where do I want to be published? And I know I'm leaning on, you know, my advisors and mentors on that conversation to think about, but also, you know, kind of like Annie had mentioned, of who's going to want to read it, right? That I have one that I've worked on that was recently accepted that I don't think in higher ed a lot of folks are going to want to read it. However, this other journal with folks that are working within healthcare education, they would want to read it. So I think it's important to think about that as well too.
I'll complete the circle and say that really quickly. The other thing is, if you get a rejection from a place and they do bring up fit as a part of your feedback, ask the editor, where do you think this should go then? Right? If they're saying it's not a fit, typically journal editors or associate editors have a good landscape of the breadth of journals. And if you need a new idea, email them back and ask and say, where do you think this might be a good fit as well?
If I could add one more thing that I thought of while Maurice was talking, something I didn't think about until recently is looking at the editorial board and what they want. So for example, the Review of Higher Education recently changed hands a few years ago, and I have noticed that there has been a greater amount of critical scholarship coming through the Review of Higher Ed under the hands of this editorial board. And so kind of balancing, if there's any letters from the editor that they write when they first take the charge, sometimes that helps give direction for what they hope to do with that journal, which I think is helpful.
Annie brings up a really good point. So I feel like I'm talking a bunch, but this is just the last point that Annie made me think about, is that sometimes journals be going through it and the review time takes a long time, and you got to figure that out, and you can figure that out by talking to other folks. And so I'm, over the years, certain journals will change leadership, or they'll change, revision or review processes or whatever. But sometimes you need a paper to kind of go through that cycle really quickly, whether it's for review or promotion or some kind of other evaluative juncture. So the timing in which your paper progresses through journals is important, and you can speak to your peers or colleagues. Oh, I submitted to so-and-so and they took so-and-so months, and that may matter or it may not matter, you know what I mean? So talk to others, basically. I mean, so many folks that probably submitted to XYZ journal, they can tell you about their experience, and that'll help inform whether you feel like you should submit there or not too.
And one last thing, but if you don't know anyone, if you're new to the field, you can see in the actual papers when they were submitted and when they were published. So if you don't know who to reach out, you can just look into the journals.
That's some really great insight, everyone. So some of you have talked about navigating relationships with co-authors and sort of having conversations about where to submit or when to submit or what to submit with your co-authors. Can you talk a little bit about navigating relationships with folks you're working on things with? And yeah, I'll leave it at that very broad.
Can you restate the question, Nick?
Sure. So just can you all talk a little bit about working with co-authors and how that maybe affects your submission timeline or your writing process, even the research process, and what that looks like?
I will say co-authors matter significantly in terms of productivity, of how quickly people are sending you back their pieces, editing, revises and resubmits with co-authors, temperaments with co-authors, different strategies and strengths. Some people are good with lit reviews, some people are good with methods. All that to say is that picking collaborators is crucial to getting manuscripts completed and also out the door and throughout the entire process. So I always talk to my co-authors about what their goals are in terms of, do they want to get it published and where they want to get it published, and also what their motives are in terms of how quickly they want to get this turned around. And I'm going to talk about that initial submission. I'm saying, as we all noted, it takes months, if not years, for some publications. Like, are they in it for the long haul? And then last, I also ask, what is your priority for this particular project? So there are a lot of great people who want to work on projects together, but you know, we all have about 3, 4, 7, 8 projects in the pipeline. If the project is number 7 on their priority list, that's fine, but that may also slow you down. So I just have open and honest conversations with my collaborators and make sure I understand what they want and what they're bringing to the table, because that's going to help me understand what working with them is going to be like, and then also how long this process will take. And then also know yourself, be true, right? Whatever you sign up for, make sure that you're bringing what you said you would bring to the table, because your co-authors are also going to be relying on you. So I think it's a delicate balance. I think it's a relationship that you have to massage and nurture over time. And the last point I will say is that if you're working with someone new and you're trying to test it out, start small, something quick. I am always hesitant to commit to a very large project that's going to be forever or take longer than I want it to take, only because if I don't know how that person works and I don't know what they're going through in terms of their process, you could have somewhat of a difficult navigating period there. It could be strange, it could be really great. It just depends. So I always say, if you're starting up new collaborations, start small, maybe a conference presentation. I don't know, maybe a book review. I have no idea, right? Start somewhere small instead of doing like a very massive manuscript for a top tier journal.
I think with the folks I've collaborated with, there are the times where we'll meet to talk about the ideas and like the arguments in the paper, the setup of the paper, whatnot. But there's also like a really important meeting about the logistics of the paper, as Maurice is saying, right? Like I will, with my collaborators, sort of reverse timeline everything and say, so when do we want to submit? And then what does that mean for all the deadlines in between now and then, and sort of working backwards. Because I think working backwards actually gives you a much more realistic, like, oh, this is how quickly things will need to get done if this is a priority for us or not. I think power is real. And I think sometimes when you are, if you, particularly as this is a panel for grads and recent grads, if you're thinking about like publishing with your advisor, depending on where the advisor is in their sort of tenure or non-tenure journey, there may be important authorship considerations they have to manage while they're managing, working, and helping you. And so I've really appreciated my conversations with my advisor to sort of say, here's what authorship order needs to look like for this, right? Let's talk about that up front. And then let's keep talking about it, because if the work actually hasn't panned out in that way, maybe we need to switch this in some ways, because there are times where folks just cannot step up to do the writing they thought they could, and you've got to fill in that gaps. But you also should then be getting credit for that in some ways in either the authorship order or somewhere else in the process. And then I think I totally agree, starting smaller with a new collaborator before going to some like big 40-page piece is going to help best keep your piece and keep the relationship alive as long as possible. I think for many of us, we have found like really great people that we've collaborated with. I think we see this actually in the authorship of the field of people who have collaborated their entire careers because they figured out a way to make it work together really well. But they didn't start that way. They started a little bit smaller than that. And so I think the right sizeness of the relationship really matters as well.
To piggyback on that, and I think it's important to, as being new to the process, and coming from my lens as someone that's relatively new to the process of knowing that it's okay to say no, that every opportunity proposed to you by your advisor or by colleagues, that it's okay to say no, that you don't have to say yes to everything just because there's like this stress and importance to add things to your CV and to your repertoire, and that you want to be able to do everything, but knowing it's okay to say no. And also, I think as I've learned, as I've gone through, is saying no to projects that don't give me energy or excitement, or also working with collaborators that don't also give me energy or excitement, right? That you have to enjoy spending time with these people and communicating with them, and that your communication styles jive together, right? And when being new to the process of really asking, how does this process work, right? That each lead author, or if you're in a special edition book chapter, that how do those editors work and how do they function, right? That maybe they want multiple different feedback points, or maybe not at all. And so I think it's important to ask that process and understand it. And if you don't know, ask. I think that's important, that I've learned the hard way of, the conference proposal process of asking what does it look like, of, oh, if you don't submit here, then you're not part of it there, or you submit it here and you're not part of this one step, you're not included and you're not listed as an author, even though you did the framing and the significant groundwork to frame the whole chapter or the whole research study, right? So I think to think about that and ask those questions, and what really gives you energy, because you're going to be living with it for multiple years or months at a time, right? So it will always be in the back of your head when you're falling asleep of, I have to work on this, I have to do that. So it has to give you life, it has to give you energy, and you have to be really passionate about the subject and a topic.
Yeah. Yeah, I want to follow up on that, especially when you're just like starting this. It's hard. You kind of want to jump to every opportunity because everything feels like an investment. Like you need to get things out, and you're like, I need to. But then if you jump into many things, you're not gonna able to like put the energy you actually need to, and that could be even worse in the long term if you're not able to manage and say yes and jump around a lot of papers, and then you're not actually following up on them. So be careful with that. And in terms of authorship, I've always published with more senior faculty, and there's a lot of there. That means I'm not gonna be the first author for a long time until I start having my own projects. And that's okay, because you're still getting your experience, you're learning a lot from them. I've learned a lot from the people that I've worked with. So it just sometimes when you're, at least for me, I was out of masters, of course I wanted to publish and have my name like plastered everywhere. And then I realized like, I'm not there yet, and that's okay.
When Jonathan was talking about communication styles, I was like, oh, definitely. And the communication styles and working styles have become almost more important to me than research overlap in collaborators. Because if we can cumulatively find a way that a manuscript jives somehow with both or 3 or 4, however many research agendas, then that works. It doesn't perfectly need to align with everyone's research agenda all the time. And what's more important to me in finding a pleasant writing process and a pleasant thinking process is to find people who communicate well, that will be willing to have these conversations with you and work openly and kindly and constructively. And so I look for collaborators that fill those energy needs.
I think just one thing I had thought of when Annie was talking there is, I think when you're thinking about collaborators, think about how you can be a supportive collaborator. I think of the folks that have taken a chance on me and asked me to join a project, and think about, as a person, as you have experience and you're moving along in the process, how can you bring other people in, right? That I feel like some of this is this ivory tower that's exclusive, like that isn't welcoming, right? And that how can we demystify it and engage other people that have a story to tell and they can contribute to this. And I think it's how can we utilize our agency in those situations to bring other folks in, that it might be as third author, fourth author, but to get involved in that process, that's the first step, right? That to demystify it and move in the process. That I think of my first time that, it was a former colleague that said, you're interested in your PhD eventually, right? Well, join this project with me. and she took a chance, and I learned so much from her. And I think that's how to, as a person that becomes more experienced, how do you support others in that process too?
Yeah, one last thing, and I feel like for one that's just starting, rely on like informal networks of like information, because sometimes you can get invited to a paper that on like paper sounds so good with very cool like faculty, and then you will find out that you will have to make like most of the work. So just rely on like informal networks of knowledge that will guide you through this very overwhelming process.
Hey, thank you all so much for the insights shared thus far. I will make this transition quick as we move from moderated Q&A, thanks Nick, to our live Q&A. So throughout this discussion, participants have been submitting questions to our editorial assistant, Karina Castro. And so she will be reading through as many of those as we can complete in the next 20 minutes or so. So I will turn it over to Karina to share the name of the first person who submitted and what their question is.
Hello, everyone. The first question from Deshawn for the panelists is, how do you navigate the internal process of conflicting pieces of feedback you get from a paper submission?
I think two pieces of advice I would offer, and this comes from my experience working as the JCSD editorial assistant for a year and a half, was one, if it's an R&R in particular, ask the editor, right? And sort of say, usually editors in their overall feedback from reviewers will try and, at their best, clarify conflictions in reviewer feedback. Sometimes they don't, and sometimes it's okay to nudge them and ask them for that feedback of like, which thing do you think I should prioritize? So that's one thing. But two is, if you don't get that clarification, don't seek it. Remember that the R&R process, and even the process of getting rejected and submitting somewhere else, it's a continuation of a scholarly argument as to why you made certain decisions that you did. It's not that reviewers say everything to you and you have to change everything that the reviewer says. Some things you get to push back on and say, actually, why we did this is this, and I provided further context as to that decision in the manuscript, right? So it's not always that you sort of have to bend to what the reviewers or editorial boards say, but you have to be able to back up your decisions or say, repeatedly, thank you for this comment, and then make the change, right? Like that is, those are sort of your multiple options rather than just sort of conforming to what the reviewers want. That's what I would offer.
Thank you. And a follow-up to that would be, how do you know which feedback to follow while also keeping true to your voice in your own work?
Well, I think Alex made a really great point. If you feel like there's no way to reconcile feedback you're receiving versus staying true to your word or true to, who you are, then as Sylvia used to call it, you get to educate the reviewer, which I thought sounded wild when I first heard it, because because when I was a grad student, I was like, but the reviewer's a reviewer, you know what I mean? And they have to know something that I don't know. Honestly, you probably have more tools than you realize. And there's a lot of great things happening in your paper that a reviewer may just not know. I've heard of papers getting rejected from journals, and they'll say the stats are faulty when the stats weren't faulty, or they'll say, you should cite this person, and it turns out that person is the person who said, you know what I mean? So sometimes reviewers just simply need to be educated. They'll have thoughts about, or wrong thoughts about CRT or the application of CRT, you know what I mean? So there's so many different ways in which there's no way to perfectly reconcile comments with your thinking of the paper. So like Alex said, you gotta, thoughtfully, not disrespectfully, of course, because they are still the reviewer and they have that power, but respond back in a way that suggests with evidence that the approach you took is consistent with extant literature is consistent with, the rest of the paper or research on this topic. And it is your chance to educate them because, they're just reviewers. I think, I got way in my head about it in grad school, but having been on the other side now, submitting reviews, we're all, especially in a pandemic, we're all just trying, so just thoughtfully comment back.
To add to Damani's point about sometimes needing to, explain your approach or educate the reviewers in some way about what you did, sometimes I find that there is like, and this requires like sitting on it and thinking about how this works in your manuscript, but sometimes there's a way to like throw the reviewer a bone and like insert a phrase that acknowledges whatever they are suggesting and validates that that is an approach that other researchers have taken, and then further situate your own work as being unique for XYZ reasons. So I think that's an approach I have taken several times in terms of like, I acknowledge that this approach is valid and awesome and has given us this type of scholarship, and I'm extending it by doing my own thing.
And also, if you're like too conflicted by a reviewer or like a review, maybe reach out to someone you trust and maybe they can read your paper and the reviewer or review comment and kind of they give you an advice, like a middle point, because sometimes we also get defensive. It's our work when we've worked for like so long in a paper, we can get like I see this and this way, and having like some mediator can help in that process, someone you trust.
Thank you all. The next question is, in addition to publishing your work in journals, in what other ways do you make your work accessible for folks beyond academia?
So I think some of our biggest power as scholars is through newspaper op-eds. I have been a big believer in how we write for public audiences. My research most recently deals with how transgender college students enter into, navigate, exit from college. And I don't know if you are aware, there's been like 48 anti-trans bills in state houses across the country in 2021 alone. And so part of how I think about writing for the public is I'm at my most powerful as a scholar when I base my public writing and my research. And so I talk about the harmful effects of these bills on college students through the work that I have done. Op-eds are, it's a real skill to write for them. They're only 300 to 500 words at best sometimes. And that is not a lot of writing. And so a lot of times I think people think of op-eds as like, this issue happened, a scholar sort of publicly responds to it within 24 hours and submits it. I have taken an approach where I actually pre-write a lot of op-eds based on my research. The op-ed project is a website I'll put in the chat in a second. It's a really great resource to think about how to write op-eds. And rather than sort of wait for the thing to happen that I know is going to happen, I pre-write my op-eds and get them ready for submission. It varies by which outlet you're sending them to, but legislative aides in both state and federal governments pay attention to local newspapers in ways that most people don't think about these days. And that is a great way if you are seeking to affect policy or public opinion to get your work out there and think about that. So I think I've now done 4 op-eds that have been published in my time here, but I've submitted more. But you sort of submit them and then it's up to those editorial boards. They usually ask for 72 hours. and they won't tell you if they're going to publish it. You've just got to keep looking. And if they don't publish it in 72 hours, you send it on to the next one. So op-eds have been a real way that I've gotten my work out there to hopefully affect change in some way.
Yeah, I like to write one-pagers or even one-sheeters where it's back and front. I focus quite a bit on policy work, so I send those one-pagers off to different policy avenues. It could be state legislatures, local officials, it could be people at the federal level, even the Commission of Higher Education, if it's your SHEO, which is your State Higher Education Executive Officer for that particular state. Nothing stops you from emailing them a quick one-pager in an email and say, hey, I've done this research. Let's talk about it, questions, this is my viewpoint. Whatever you're trying to get across, translation of data, no matter who you're speaking to, whether it's a colleague, students, people outside of the academic bubble, translation is always a great skill to have. So what I do in my policy work is try to translate my 40-page manuscript with quantitative methods into one quick page that people can access, understand, and have a takeaway, whether it's recommendation, a learning point, whatever the case may be for that particular one-pager. I think that's always a great practice. No one says you have to wait for a journal editorial board to knight your paper, knight your publication for people to see it. You are the author, you are in control of it, you get to send it out. So that's another way to do it.
Thank you all so much for your insight. The next question is from Lizette, and it is, do you have any tips for taking research you've done in doctoral coursework and building upon them to create manuscripts out of that work?
Andy does.
Thanks, Damani. This is a great question, and I think it's really important to think about the ways that doctoral coursework can be leveraged, either the actual writing or the thought process. And it's important to remember that thinking is also writing, because sometimes just the act of doing a project in a coursework gets you closer to a thing that you actually want to keep pursuing. So I would say that it's common that the project that I did, at least in coursework, was not complete in coursework. It was, it was a paper that I submitted as a final, but it needed some work after coursework. And I had to make the decision in the case that I'm thinking of like, okay, well, what is necessary for me to work on before it gets submitted? What, to an earlier question, what am I kind of willing to live with or willing to just see what the reaction is by the reviewers before making serious overhauls to this. So I think it is a two-part process of reflecting on your own motivations to keep going with the project, and also keeping in mind where it can take you in the future.
I think additionally, I think of as this tonight is actually my last class of my doctoral journey. Thank God this is a terminal degree. My mother is gonna be so excited that I'm done with school. But I've thought of, in the last 2 years here working on my PhD, is that making every assignment work for me in another way. So this semester I'm in a qualitative methods course, looking at survey design. And this whole time I've been kind of in the background using one of the assignments to work on developing my survey questions that I'm hoping to use for my dissertation when I start data collection. And so my faculty member, she's an expert of the art of asking questions. And literally she studies this of how the wording of questions and what do they look like and what questions order do we put it in and how do we ask it. And so being able to utilize that, because I'm gonna have to do it later eventually, so I might as well do it during this class and allow her to give me constructive feedback to guide me in the process. Or in addition, another course, I'm in a quant class as well right now, and I've been developing questions for another side project I'm working on. And if I'm gonna be launching this research project, I might as well let these classes teach me it, but also instead use these assignments to work on it, right? That as I'm laying the groundwork for these research projects, that it's going to save me time in the fall when I'm working on it. And it's actually moved me along quicker. That the one class, I've already launched the research study, and I have 100 participants already. Part of it, my goal was to launch it in June, and I'm almost done with data collection. And so think about how do you allow that to happen with building research projects, but also in your writing process as well. Of if you're doing a lit search in a class, do it on the topic that you're interested in. So at least maybe that's not the topic you're going in, but at least your brain is thinking about it more often, and you're honing in on your research question, and you're becoming a better expert in your topic area that gets you excited.
Yeah, I will just quickly add, if you use that approach of using your coursework, especially over multiple semesters, multiple courses, let the instructor or the professor know what you're trying to build towards, whether it's a scholarly paper or a manuscript. These people have published, that's like free feedback, that's free reviewers that you don't have to like wait to get to the manuscript review process with. So if you just articulate, this is what I'm trying to do, this is what I'm trying to accomplish, can you give me a little bit extra feedback in terms of publishing? They love that. I love that as a faculty member. So use them. You're already in their space. It's free and it's great advice.
Thank you. And it looks like we have time for one final question, which is, what tips do you have for negotiating author order as a grad student?
Everyone made a face like, oh.
Well, so this is one of those questions for me. It's like, who are the other authors, right? Is it my advisor or is it like peers and other students, right? The conversations are very different. So with my advisor, she told me where I was going to land, and I just kind of went along with it. If I was writing with other students, peers, someone that was a little bit more, we started the project together, then the negotiation would be, all right, who's going to take leadership of the logistics? Who's actually going to proofread the entire thing? Who's going to really take control? That's first author. Or it could be, whose idea was it to get us started? That's fine. We also have had conversations about the labor. So if methods were really going to eat up a lot of the paper, or a lot of the time, and that's what the paper was going to be known for, then that person was going to lead in terms of authorship. So I think you have multiple things to consider in terms of the project, the idea, and what is the ultimate goal, and who's going to take lead on some parts. I will say you don't always have to be first author on everything. Whatever projects you are working on, have a smattering. If you're trying to be first author on 5 projects, you're going to run yourself into the ground. And that means that once you can be first author on one project and simultaneously be second or third on another project and second and third on another, right? Just mix it up a little bit for yourself. You're going to be much happier and much more at peace with that process.
Expanding on what Maurice said too, I think it's important, and something it took me a minute to realize this, but you have agency in different places depending on who you're working with. So if it is your advisor, and if authorship order is set from the get-go, maybe you can talk about scope of work, and maybe you can have a transparent conversation about what this is supposed to look like and how it can all play out. So there's different parts where you might be able to poke a little bit.
I think just making sure to be forward with people and just sort of ask, where do you need this authorship to be, right? If it's my primary advisor while I've been at Iowa for the first 3 years was an assistant professor on the tenure track who was going up for tenure at the end of my 3rd year. And that meant something a little bit different about authorship order than things that we're more currently working on now. There are times where a lot of us are in programs where you have access to big data sets. You need to ask, is there an expectation that you're an author on this if you don't write anything for this, right? Is there an expectation that because I'm using your data, you need to be reflected at some place in the authorship order? Writing or no writing, there are those sort of unspoken expectations at times, and there are some people who I almost cursed, who could care less about their authorship order if you're using their data, and there are some people who are very particular about it. So having those conversations really upfront, I think is honestly the best tip I can give, because if you're no matter what your relationship with the person is, when it comes down to authorship, folks really start unhiding the curriculum a lot of what they want in the world. So.
We have a few minutes left for any other tidbits or final closing thoughts that our panelists would like to offer. I open it up to you to just contribute to this community of, 35 grad students eager to learn from your wisdom.
No tidbit, just a Maurice insight and my own preference about what Alex was speaking on. I always think deep and hard and very long on if I'm using someone else's data, if they mandate I put them on as an author and they're not going to do anything for the manuscript. I know we sometimes get in places where that's the only available data set, or we feel like that's the only way. I just encourage everyone to think deeply about what that means for your work and what you have to do, and the credits that you're giving people if they're not going to contribute whatsoever other than giving you an Excel file or a flash drive. I tend to avoid it, but once again, if that is your opportunity, just think hard about what you need to do with that. That's all I will say on that point.
Unrelated, but great point, Maurice. Something I've been thinking about lately is, so I'll look at scholars in the field, senior, junior, whatever, and I'll see that they're just publishing like crazy, you know what I mean? And I'm just thinking like, is there some kind of like secret sauce or whatever? Maybe there are fewer demands on their time. Could be a number of sort of equity considerations for how some folks get more work done than others. One thing I've been thinking about lately, and I've really clearly observed this in the field, is that there are varying degrees to which, especially if you're working with a co-author, how comfortable we are releasing something to feedback. So imagine like two different universes, right? There's like one universe, A, where I'm like, super insecure about a paper. I'm really anxious. I'm worried someone's going to think I'm dumb. And so I try to perfect it and I don't give it to somebody to review for like another month, right? That's a month that could have been in review or in somebody else's hands. And I'll just say this, some people are sort of universe two and the opposite, where they'll let somebody else provide feedback and it will move the paper further along because they're correcting for the things that you may have been able to correct for it if you just let it go a little bit sooner. And there are a number of reasons why we don't let go of work, right? I mean, like I was saying, like we're insecure, there's imposter syndrome, we're worried that people may think we're less than, but, and those are legitimate inequities, within the terrain of publishing. But I think there's something to be said about especially if you're working with supportive co-authors, or just if you're trying to solicit feedback from a mentor or colleague in the field, let it go, those concerns are legitimate and they're there, but I mean, sometimes, and I'll speak for myself truly, I'll just hold on to something and person B has already let somebody else, make changes, right? And, not saying any names, but I mean, they'll just let things go so quickly and then it'll pop up in a journal. Meanwhile, I'm still working on something. More can be said about that, but I'll leave it at that.
And I think a final tidbit that I think of is related to that of back to my summer days as a camp counselor of share, don't compare, that, work with colleagues and sharing with your colleagues of the process and the journey. Don't compare yourselves to others in this process. And think about how the process is going for you and what has been meaningful to you and worked well for you. And how can you later, when you are in that process of, when you're that faculty member or you're that experienced scholar, of how do you support others in that? And that's the same thing of taking on projects, to author order, to sharing data. What would you have liked in your doctoral journey? That I know we all have different experiences, that I've had some great co-authorships with some faculty that were like, you did all the work, you're gonna go be first author. Or I've had some where just because they were faculty, they want to be first author. So I think about that process and share, but don't compare it to others and your successes or in the journey, that it's different for everybody, right?
Annie or Astrid, want to take us home? Make sure you get a chance as well.
Yeah, I'll say something. You're usually surrounded with peers that you trust, and I feel like that's very important. If you're too scared that like a faculty or someone you admire will read your work and will find it very bad, you can send it first to a friend that like knows about the topic and can read it first and can give you like a more kind advice before you send it to someone that scares you and you admire. So like publishing is very communal. You're working with other people, you're thinking with other people, rely on them.
The last thing I'll say, and I said this in the chat too, is just be kind to yourself. This is a long journey, oftentimes full of warm, cool, cold feedback all along the way. And it's just important to remember that we're always learning and we're always changing how we would do things. And one thing I've, struggled with is the permanence of writing and how I'm always evolving as a scholar. But that is something that is just a tension throughout our careers that we have to live among and grow with. So.
Thank you for the opportunity to allow us to grow with you for the last hour. We really appreciate your time, Maurice, Alex, Annie, John, Astrid, Damani, and thank you, Nick, for putting this panel together. The session was recorded. Yay, virtual applause. Session was recorded. We'll be sharing a link to that file for those who registered, and you can also share this among your network. So again, I hope you have a wonderful afternoon. Thank you for joining us. And you can email us at jcshesa@gmail.com with any questions. Bye. Thanks.